Hello, everybody. So today's reading talked about two very different topics. So I think we're going to do a two-parter. The first video, we're going to look at the environmental movements of the turn of the 20th century. And then we're going to be examining the Jim Crow era and efforts to achieve civil rights during the Progressive era. So let's pick up by answering this first guiding question for today by looking at the ways in which the conservationist movement align with the goals of the progressives. So, in order to get into all this, I think it's really important for us to realize that not all environmentalists thought the same way during this time period. So, there were major concerns regarding the environmental destruction that was taking place because of the rapid expansion and industrialization of the United States. So, we already know that the bison were nearly extinct over the course of just a few decades, as railroads were laid across the United States, as homesteads were built, etc. We also know that entire forests were destroyed by logging industries. There was no regulation regarding chemical dumping, so environmentalists had many reasons to be concerned. Historians distinguish between these two different approaches for how to preserve the environment. So, on the one hand, we have preservationists. Preservationists wanted to leave the land the way that it was in nature. Then you have conservationists. They wanted the land to be reserved, but they were okay with its use for resources. So they were okay with using water within that land or lumber. So the Hetchy controversy demonstrates the differences between the conservationist and preservationist beliefs. So in the Hetchy Valley, which was in California in present-day Yosemite National Park, developers wanted to build a dam for hydroelectric power. And ultimately, the preservationists, led by John Muir, who also founded the Sierra Club, wanted that valley to remain the way that it was. And so he spoke adamantly against constructing this dam. On the conservationist side of the controversy, we have Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the National Forestry Service. And he believed that this land should be set aside and protected against private ownership, but that the land should still be used for its resources. Gifford Pinchot allegedly said, "Everybody needs beauty as well as bread." And ultimately, with the Hetchy controversy, the conservationists won out. Congress approved the construction of the dam in 1913, and then the valley was flooded. So let's think about Roosevelt's role also as a conservationist. Before he was president, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act in 1891. And when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he used this act to set aside over 150 million acres of federal land as national reserves that could not be sold to private interests. And then in 1902, Congress passed the Newlands Reclamation Act that Roosevelt signed, which provided money for the sale of public land for irrigation projects in the western states. And then in 1901, towards the end of Roosevelt's presidency, he held a meeting to coordinate conservation planning by federal and state governments. And the result of that meeting was the establishment of the National Conservation Commission, which created efficient management of the nation's resources and ensured state cooperation. Now, when Roosevelt left the White House, some of these plans were not continued by President Taft, and this was one of them. The National Conservation Commission lost its funding the following year and then disbanded. Roosevelt, going back to him for a moment, he again set aside millions of acres of forest reserves. I already mentioned that. And he set aside over 1.5 million acres of water power sites. He established 50 wildlife sanctuaries and several national parks. And the national parks are a good example of the goals of conservation. Again, the land was set aside from private development, but they were still open for the public for recreational purposes. It's very utilitarian, the idea that this land does the greatest good for the greatest number. The economic impact is also significant to think about. Conservation generated mass amounts of revenue because the government could still charge industries like lumber and water, as well as tourists to access these spaces. And some critics also argue that conservation made the land access less egalitarian. So, for example, not everyone can afford to pay for hunting permits, and so poorer individuals who often rely on hunting for subsistence no longer can access these spaces for something that they had done previously for free. Some conservationists and preservationists also argued on behalf of animal welfare. So one example is the passenger pigeon, which went extinct in the late 19th century, was it was hunted to excess on the East Coast, and women's activists campaigned against using animals in fashion, particularly putting feathers in one's hat. So, Roosevelt himself, though, was not an animal rights activist. You've probably been staring at this picture on the lower right for quite a while. We've been hanging out on this slide here, so I should explain it. After Roosevelt left the White House in 1909, he went to Africa on an 11-month, 2,500-mile safari. And in this safari, he shot or trapped over 11,000 animals, including elephants, hippos, and white rhinos. And I should say also that this safari was paid for by the Smithsonian Institute, according to the Theodore Roosevelt Association. So this was totally government funded. But I just want to point out that even though Teddy Roosevelt does have this reputation for being this environmental conservationist, he as an individual loved hunting. So he very much was emblematic of what the conservationists stood for. Preserve this land, but use it, right? And his safari example is honestly using this to excess, right? So moving forward, I think that's it for environmental conservation. It's just one slide here, but packed with information. We'll pick up with our continued conversations about Jim Crow, this time by looking at how Jim Crow is actually intersecting with the progressive movement. So stay tuned for that, and thanks so much.